The afternoon sun beat down on the concrete as 16-year-old Jasmine Carter stood at the bus stop, one foot tapping to the beat coming through her earbuds. School had let out 20 minutes ago, and most of her friends had already headed home. She'd stay behind to talk with her science teacher about the upcoming project, the kind of responsible thing that made her parents proud but didn't exactly boost her popularity. Jasmine checked the time on her phone and sighed. The bus was running late again. This route always seemed to have problems, especially on Fridays when everyone was in a rush to get home. She adjusted her backpack, feeling the weight of textbooks digging into her shoulder. Junior year was no joke, and her father's expectations made it even tougher. Dad would say this builds character, she muttered to herself with a small smile. Her father never accepted excuses, but he always had her back. As one of the few black FBI agents in his division, he taught her early on about moving through the world carefully. It's not fair, he told her, but it's reality. Across the street, Officer Michael Reynolds drove his patrol car slowly, scanning the area. He was new to this district, transferred after a complaint at his previous post, nothing that stuck, but enough to make his superiors think a change of scenery might help. They'd told him about drug activity near the high school, and he was determined to make a good impression. His eyes landed on Jasmine. Something about her movements seemed suspicious to him, the way she kept checking her phone, adjusting her bag, looking up and down the street. Training kicked in, or maybe something else, something he didn't examine too closely. Reynolds pulled his car to the curb and stepped out, adjusting his belt with its heavy equipment. His hand rested near his holster as he approached, not drawing his weapon, but keeping it accessible. Standard procedure, he told himself. "Excuse me, miss," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of the badge. "Can I see some ID?" Jasmine looked up, startled. She pulled out her earbuds. "I'm sorry, what?" "Identification," Reynolds said more firmly. "What are you doing in this area?" Confusion crossed Jasmine's face. "I'm waiting for the bus. I live just 3 blocks that way." She pointed down the street. "Aha," Reynolds said, not bothering to look where she pointed. "I need to see some ID. We've had reports of drug activity in this area." Jasmine's heart began to pound. Her father's warnings echoed in her head. "Keep calm. Don't argue. Identify yourself clearly." She reached for her school ID in her pocket. "Slowly," Reynolds cautioned, his hand moving closer to his weapon. A few people across the street noticed the interaction. An older woman slowed her walk, watching with concern. A man in a business suit paused, then pulled out his phone and began recording discreetly. "I'm just a student," Jasmine explained, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I go to Roosevelt High. I'm waiting for the number 17 bus." Reynolds took her school ID, examining it with unnecessary scrutiny. "This doesn't have your address on it. Do you have any other identification?" "I'm 16, Jasmine replied. "I don't have a driver's license yet." "Place your backpack on the ground and put your hands against the wall," Reynolds instructed, pointing to the bus shelter. "What? Why?" Jasmine asked, her voice rising slightly. "I didn't do anything." "This is just procedure," Reynolds said. "Do it now, please." More people had gathered now. Someone whispered, "She's just a kid." Another said, "Is he seriously detaining her?" With shaking hands, Jasmine set down her backpack and placed her palms against the glass wall of the bus shelter. Reynolds took her phone from her hand and set it on top of her bag. "I'm going to call this in," he said, reaching for his radio. "Just stay still." Tears threatened at the corners of Jasmine's eyes, but she blinked them back. She wouldn't cry. Not here, not now. And then her phone rang. The screen lit up with a single word. "Dad." 3 minutes had passed since Officer Reynolds had first approached her. Those 3 minutes were about to change everything. The phone continued to ring, its cheerful tune a strange contrast to the tension in the air. Officer Reynolds glanced down at the device, hesitating for just a moment before picking it up. "Don't answer that," Jasmine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, just let me talk to my dad." Reynolds ignored her plea. "Hello," he answered, his tone professional but strained. The crowd of onlookers had grown to almost a dozen people now. A woman with groceries. A mail carrier paused on his route. 2 high school boys with backpacks similar to Jasmine's. All watching. all waiting, some with phones raised, recording everything. "Who is this?" came the voice from the phone, deep and measured. "Where is my daughter?" Reynolds straightened his posture, though the person on the other end couldn't see him. Something about that voice made him stand at attention. "This is Officer Michael Reynolds, sir. I'm conducting a routine stop. Let me speak to Jasmine." Now, the voice left no room for argument. Reynolds held the phone toward Jasmine, who still stood with her hands against the wall of the bus shelter. She turned her head slightly. "Dad," she said, her voice cracking despite her best efforts to stay calm. "I'm at the bus stop after school. This officer, he thinks I did something wrong." "Are you hurt?" her father asked. "No, I'm okay, just scared." "Turn around, look at your surroundings, and tell me exactly where you are." Jasmine looked at Reynolds, silently asking permission. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. She turned away from the wall. "I'm at the stop on Maple and 4th, the one I always use after school. I'll be there in 3 minutes. Put the officer back on." Reynolds took the phone back, his confidence visibly wavering. "Sir, I need to explain that we've had reports of suspicious activity in this area, and I was simply—" "Officer Reynolds," the voice cut in, each word precise and measured. "My name is Special Agent James Carter, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm going to ask you once. What probable cause do you have to detain my 16-year-old daughter?" Reynolds' face drained of color. The small crowd watching could see the change, though they couldn't hear the words being spoken. One of the high school boys whispered to the other, "Dude, something's happening." "Agent Carter," Reynolds said, his voice now noticeably higher. "There was no detention taking place. I was simply questioning." "You made my daughter place her hands against a wall," Agent Carter interrupted. "That constitutes a detention under Terry v. Ohio. Now, I'll ask again, what is your probable cause?" Reynolds swallowed hard. "We've had reports of drug activity in the area." "General reports are not probable cause for detaining a specific individual. Is my daughter displaying signs of intoxication? Did you witness her engaging in a hand-to-hand transaction? Is she carrying contraband in plain view?" "No, sir, but—" "Then you have no legal basis for this detention. I'll be there momentarily. In the meantime, I suggest you contact your supervising officer. They should be present for our conversation." The line went dead. Reynolds stayed at the phone for a long moment before looking up at Jasmine, who stood watching him with a mixture of fear and something new, a hint of relief. "You can put your hands down," he said quietly. Jasmine slowly lowered her arms, wincing as she rolled her shoulders. "Can I have my phone back, please?" Reynolds handed it to her, his movements mechanical. He seemed to be replaying the conversation in his head, possibly realizing how quickly the situation had spiraled beyond his control. The mail carrier who had been watching stepped forward. "Everything okay here?" he asked, looking directly at Jasmine. "My dad's coming," she replied, her voice stronger now. The crowd didn't disperse. If anything, more people were gathering, drawn by the unusual scene. An older man with a cane. A young mother holding her child's hand. 2 college students. They formed a loose circle around the bus stop, not interfering but clearly watching. Their presence seemed to make Officer Reynolds increasingly uncomfortable as he radioed his station. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reynolds. I need a supervisor at Maple and 4th. He paused, listening to the response. "Yes, right away. We have a situation developing." In the distance, the sound of screeching tires cut through the afternoon air. A black SUV turned the corner sharply, moving with purpose. Jasmine's phone buzzed with a text message. "I see you. Don't move." She took a deep breath and stood taller, watching as the SUV approached. The black SUV pulled up to the curb with precision, its engine purring to a stop. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man who commanded attention without saying a word. Special Agent James Carter wore no uniform, just a crisp, dark suit that fit him perfectly. His badge hung on a chain around his neck, catching the afternoon sunlight. At 45, he moved with the energy of someone much younger, but his eyes held the experience of someone who had seen far more than most. He scanned the scene quickly, taking in his daughter, the officer, and the gathering of onlookers, before walking straight to Jasmine. "You okay, baby girl?" he asked quietly, his hand gently touching her shoulder. Jasmine nodded, fighting back tears. "I'm fine, Dad." Carter studied her face for a moment, then turned to Officer Reynolds. The contrast between the two men was striking. Reynolds, in his police uniform with all its official trappings, somehow looked smaller next to Carter in his simple suit. "Officer Reynolds," Carter said, extending his hand. "James Carter, FBI." Reynolds shook his hand, his palm slightly damp. "Sir, I want to explain." "I'm sure you do," Carter said, cutting him off politely but firmly. "But first, is your supervisor on the way?" "Yes, sir. Should be here any minute." Carter nodded. "Good. While we wait, I'd like my daughter's backpack returned to her, please." Reynolds handed the backpack to Jasmine, who clutched it to her chest like a shield. "Now," Carter continued, his voice perfectly level, "I'd like you to explain to me, in your own words, why you detained a 16-year-old girl who was simply waiting for public transportation." Reynolds shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Sir, as I tried to explain on the phone, we've had reports of drug activity in this area. Your daughter was exhibiting suspicious behavior." "What behavior specifically?" Carter asked. "She was looking around nervously, checking her phone repeatedly, adjusting her backpack." As Reynolds spoke, the absurdity of his reasoning became clear to everyone listening. One woman in the crowd made a sound of disbelief. "So," Carter said, "she was acting like a normal teenager waiting for a bus that was running late." A police cruiser pulled up behind Reynolds' car, and an older officer stepped out. Lieutenant Wilson, according to his nameplate, had the weathered look of someone who'd been on the force for decades. "Officer Reynolds," he called out, approaching the group. "What's the situation here?" Before Reynolds could answer, Carter stepped forward, extending his hand again. "Lieutenant Wilson, I'm Special Agent James Carter, FBI. This is my daughter, Jasmine." Officer Reynolds detained her without probable cause while she was waiting for her bus after school. Wilson looked from Carter to Reynolds, then to Jasmine, putting the pieces together quickly. "I see," he said carefully. "Officer Reynolds is new to our district." "Being new doesn't exempt one from knowing basic constitutional rights," Carter replied, "or from understanding what does and doesn't constitute suspicious behavior." The growing crowd had fallen silent, watching the exchange with rapt attention. The mail carrier who had stopped earlier still hadn't moved on with his route. The two high school boys were whispering to each other, occasionally glancing at their phones where they'd been recording. Lieutenant Wilson turned to Jasmine. "Miss, I want to apologize for any distress this has caused you." Jasmine nodded but didn't speak. Her hand had found her father's, and she held it tightly. "I appreciate that," Carter said. "But an apology isn't enough. I want to know what your department is doing about racial profiling, because that's what happened here, whether Officer Reynolds realizes it or not." Reynolds started to protest, but Wilson silenced him with a look. "Agent Carter," Wilson said, "I'd like to discuss this further, perhaps somewhere more private." Carter shook his head. "With all due respect, Lieutenant, there was nothing private about my daughter being forced to put her hands against a wall in full view of the public. There was nothing private about her being made to feel like a criminal for existing in her own neighborhood." The word neighborhood seemed to trigger something in Reynolds. "Sir, I didn't know she lived around here." This area," Carter interrupted, "has been my home for 12 years. My daughter was born here. I've worked with your department on 3 federal cases, and yet she still can't wait for a bus without being harassed." A car horn honked somewhere down the street, breaking the tension momentarily. Carter looked at his watch. "The bus Jasmine was waiting for should be here in 4 minutes," he said. "After it comes, the 3 of us are going to have a longer conversation at your precinct, and Lieutenant Wilson, I suggest you prepare for a formal complaint." Wilson nodded gravely. "I understand." The crowd watching had grown even larger now, and the story was already spreading through texts and social media. What had started as a routine stop was about to become much more. The bus arrived right on schedule. Agent Carter nodded to Jasmine. "You should go home now. Your mom will be waiting." Jasmine glanced between her father and the officers. "Dad, are you sure?" "I can stay." Carter's stern expression softened as he looked at his daughter. "You've been through enough today. Go home, tell Mom what happened. I'll be there soon." Jasmine hesitated, then hugged her father tightly. "Don't be too hard on them," she whispered, showing a kindness that made Carter's chest tighten with pride. As Jasmine boarded the bus, many of the onlookers dispersed, but a few remained, curious about what would happen next. The mail carrier finally continued on his route, but not before giving Carter a respectful nod. "Shall we continue this at the station?" Lieutenant Wilson suggested, clearly wanting to get away from the public eye. "Let's," Carter agreed, his voice calm but leaving no room for argument. The drive to the police station took less than 10 minutes. Carter followed the police cruiser in his SUV, using the time to make a quick call to his wife. "Lisa, Jasmine's on her way home. There was an incident." "No, she's fine, just shaken up. I'm handling it." At the station, they settled into a small conference room. The walls were beige, decorated with framed certificates and a large map of the district. Coffee was offered and declined. "Let me be clear about something," Carter began, sitting across from both officers. "I'm not here as an FBI agent right now. I'm here as a father whose daughter was wrongfully detained. But my background gives me a unique understanding of how this situation should have been handled." Reynolds fidgeted with his pen, avoiding eye contact. "Officer Reynolds," Carter continued, "walk me through your training on reasonable suspicion versus probable cause." The question caught Reynolds off guard. "We're taught that reasonable suspicion is when facts or circumstances would lead a reasonable officer to believe criminal activity is happening. Probable cause requires more concrete evidence. And which did you have when you approached my daughter?" Reynolds swallowed hard. "I believed I had reasonable suspicion based on a teenage girl waiting for a bus," Carter finished for him. "Tell me, if Jasmine had been white, would you have considered her behavior suspicious?" The question hung in the air. Lieutenant Wilson cleared his throat. "Agent Carter, I don't think it's fair to assume." "It's a straightforward question," Carter insisted. "We can dance around it, or we can address the real issue here." Reynolds looked up finally. "I would like to think I would have responded the same way regardless of race." "You'd like to think," Carter repeated. "But you can't say for certain." "No one can say for certain what they would do in a hypothetical situation," Wilson interjected. Carter's phone buzzed. He glanced down to see a text from his wife. "It's already on social media. 3 videos from different angles." He placed his phone on the table, screen up so both officers could see the message. "This isn't going away," he said simply. "And it shouldn't. Not until we address what happened and why." Lieutenant Wilson sighed. "What exactly are you looking for here, Agent Carter?" "An official reprimand for Officer Reynolds. Because I can tell you right now, based on what I've heard. What I want," Carter said, leaning forward, "is change. Starting with this department. I want every officer to receive additional training on racial profiling. I want a community oversight committee with actual power. And I want Officer Reynolds to understand exactly why what he did was wrong." Reynolds looked genuinely confused. "Sir, I was just doing my job." "No," Carter said firmly. "Your job is to protect and serve everyone in this community. Your job is to understand the difference between actual suspicious behavior and a black teenager existing in public space. Your job is to know the law well enough not to violate it while enforcing it." The conference room fell silent. Outside, phones rang and officers chatted, unaware of the intense conversation happening behind the closed door. "I have connections at the Department of Justice," Carter continued, his tone softening slightly. "People who specialize in police reform. This could go one of 2 ways. It could become a public relations nightmare for your department, or it could be the catalyst for meaningful change." Lieutenant Wilson studied Carter's face. "You're serious about this?" "Deadly serious," Carter confirmed. "What happened to Jasmine today happens to people who don't have FBI agents for parents. People who don't know their rights or how to fight back. And sometimes those situations end much worse than this one did." Wilson nodded slowly. "I'd like to hear your suggestions for this training program." A small victory. Carter allowed himself a brief moment of hope before outlining his initial thoughts. As they talked, Officer Reynolds remained quiet, listening. Whether he was learning or simply enduring remained to be seen. When Agent Carter finally returned home that evening, the house was quiet except for the low murmur of the TV in the living room. He found his wife Lisa curled up on the couch, scrolling through her phone with a worried expression. "How's Jasmine?" he asked, loosening his tie as he sat beside her. Lisa leaned against him, her warmth a comfort after the tense day. "She's in her room. Said she had homework, but I think she just needed some space. James, the videos are everywhere. Her friends have all seen them." Carter nodded, unsurprised but still troubled. How is she handling that part of it? "Better than I would have at 16, Lisa admitted. She actually said she's glad it was recorded, that it makes people believe her. The fact that his daughter already understood the importance of having proof made Carter's heart ache. Children shouldn't have to know such things. "I'm going to check on her," he said, pressing a kiss to Lisa's forehead. He climbed the stairs slowly, suddenly feeling the weight of the day. At Jasmine's door he knocked gently. "Come in," she called. Jasmine sat cross-legged on her bed, textbooks spread around her, but her eyes were fixed on her laptop screen. Carter sat on the edge of the bed, noticing she was watching one of the videos from the bus stop. "You don't have to keep watching that," he said softly. She closed the laptop. "They're saying I'm lucky. All the comments, they keep saying if you hadn't shown up." Her voice trailed off. Carter reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear like he used to do when she was small. "But I did show up. And even if I hadn't, you know your rights. You were doing everything right." "That doesn't always matter though, does it?" Jasmine's question hung in the air, painfully honest. "No," Carter admitted. "Sometimes it doesn't. But today it did. And tomorrow, and the day after that, we keep working to make sure it matters for everyone." Jasmine nodded, seeming both older and younger than her 16 years. "So what happened after I left? Did they apologize? Are they going to fire that officer?" "It's complicated," Carter began, then stopped himself. "Actually, no. It's not complicated. What that officer did was wrong, plain and simple. But fixing the bigger problem, that's the complicated part." He explained the meeting at the station, how Lieutenant Wilson had eventually agreed to implement new training programs and community oversight measures. As for Officer Reynolds, Carter continued, he's been placed on desk duty pending further training, and he'll be doing community service hours at the youth center. Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "Community service? Like a punishment?" "Not exactly. More like an education. He needs to know the community he's policing, really know it." That conversation was interrupted by the doorbell. Carter checked his watch, nearly 9 p.m., too late for casual visitors. "Stay here," he told Jasmine, instantly back in protective mode. Downstairs, Lisa was already at the door, peering through the peephole. "It's a police officer," she said as Carter joined her. "Not the same one from today." Carter opened the door to find a young officer standing awkwardly on their porch, cap in hand. "Agent Carter. I'm Officer Thomas. I wanted to drop this off." He held out an envelope. "It's from the entire precinct. We took up a collection for your daughter's youth advocacy group at school." Carter hadn't mentioned any youth group. He took the envelope, puzzled. "Sir, we all saw the videos," Officer Thomas continued, shifting his weight nervously. "A lot of us have kids Jasmine's age. What happened wasn't right. And we figured, if she wanted to start something to help other kids know their rights, well, we should support that." From the top of the stairs, Jasmine had been listening. Now she came down, stopping beside her father. "I don't have an advocacy group," she said simply. Officer Thomas looked embarrassed. "Oh, I'm sorry. We just assumed. There's been talk online about you starting one." Jasmine exchanged a look with her parents. "I mean, I could start one. I've been thinking about it, actually." There was a new determination in her voice. "My friends and I were talking earlier. None of them really know what to do if they get stopped by police." Carter felt a surge of pride mixed with sadness. This wasn't what he wanted for his daughter, to have her teenage years defined by such adult concerns. But Jasmine had always had a strong sense of justice, even as a small child. "If you do start something," Officer Thomas said, "the department would like to be involved. Maybe some of us could come speak to your group. Answer questions." It was a small gesture, perhaps, but meaningful. A bridge being built where before there had only been division. "I'd like that," Jasmine said after a moment's consideration. As Officer Thomas left, the Carter family stood together in the doorway, watching him go. The night was clear, stars visible despite the city lights. "This doesn't fix everything," Lisa said quietly. "No," Carter agreed. "But it's a start." Jasmine leaned against her father's side, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. A start, she echoed, and in her voice there was hope. If you do start something, Officer Thomas said, the department would like to be involved. Maybe some of us could come speak to your group, answer questions. It was a small gesture, perhaps, but meaningful. A bridge being built where before there had only been division. I'd like that, Jasmine said after a moment's consideration. As Officer Thomas left, the Carter family stood together in the doorway, watching him go. The night was clear, stars visible despite the city lights. This doesn't fix everything, Lisa said quietly. No, Carter agreed. But it's a start. Jasmine leaned against her father's side, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. A start, she echoed, and in her voice there was hope. 2 weeks passed. The videos of Jasmine's detention had racked up millions of views across social media platforms. News stations had picked up the story, running headlines like FBI agent confronts officer who wrongfully detained his daughter, and viral video sparks police reform discussions. Jasmine sat in her school's empty classroom after the final bell, arranging chairs in a circle. Her hands moved quickly, nervous energy making her faster than usual. Today was the first meeting of what she decided to call Know Your Rights, not the catchiest name, but clear and to the point, just like her dad had taught her. Need any help with that? Jasmine looked up to see her history teacher, Mrs. Chen, standing in the doorway. That would be great, thanks, Jasmine said, relieved for the assistance and the distraction from her nerves. As they set up together, Mrs. Chen asked, "How many students do you expect today?" "I'm not sure. 15 signed up, but who knows how many will actually show." Mrs. Chen smiled kindly. "Whatever the number, what you're doing matters." The first students began arriving, a mix of faces, some friends, some just curious classmates who'd seen the videos. By the time they were ready to start, 23 students filled the circle, more than Jasmine had dared hope for. Hi everyone, she began, her voice shakier than she intended. "Thanks for coming. I guess you all know why I started this group." A boy near the back raised his hand. "Is it true your dad made that cop cry?" Scattered laughter broke the tension. Jasmine smiled despite herself. "No, that's definitely not true. My dad doesn't work that way. He's about fixing problems, not creating new ones." She took a deep breath and continued more confidently. "What happened to me happens to people every day. The only difference is my dad knew exactly what to say because of his job. Most people don't have that advantage." The classroom door opened and a uniformed police officer stepped in. The room fell instantly silent. Jasmine recognized Officer Thomas from his visit to her house. "Sorry I'm late," he said, standing awkwardly just inside the door. "Is it still okay if I join you?" Jasmine nodded, gesturing to an empty chair. Some students shifted uncomfortably as Officer Thomas sat down. One girl even stood up as if to leave, then slowly sat back down, arms crossed defensively. "This is Officer Thomas," Jasmine explained. "He's here because he wants to help. Part of knowing your rights is understanding how things are supposed to work from both sides." The initial discussion was stilted, with students reluctant to ask questions directly to the officer. But gradually, as Jasmine shared her experience and what she'd learned from it, the ice began to thaw. "So if a police officer asks to search my backpack, I can say no?" asked a freshman boy who barely looked 14. "You can," Officer Thomas confirmed. "Unless they have probable cause to believe there's evidence of a crime in your bag, they need consent to search it." "But what if they search it anyway?" asked another student. "Like, what if they just don't care what we say?" A heavy question. Jasmine looked to Officer Thomas, curious about his answer. "Then they've violated your rights," he said simply, "and there should be consequences for that." "Like what happened with that other officer, Reynolds?" someone asked. Officer Thomas nodded. "Officer Reynolds is currently going through additional training and working community service hours, and our entire department is implementing new procedures." "Because of Jasmine's dad," another student said, sounding impressed. "Partly," Officer Thomas agreed, "but also because of Jasmine, and because of those videos and all the people who spoke up." The discussion continued for nearly an hour, ranging from practical advice to deeper questions about systemic issues. As they wrapped up, Jasmine felt a sense of accomplishment she hadn't expected. This wasn't just about her experience anymore, It had become something bigger. After the meeting, as students filed out, chatting excitedly about the next session, Officer Thomas approached Jasmine. "You did good today," he said. "Really good." "Thanks," Jasmine replied. "Will you come back next week?" The students had more questions than we could get to. "I'll be here," he promised. "And I was thinking, if you're interested, maybe we could organize a tour of the station. Show everyone how things work behind the scenes." Jasmine considered this. "That could be helpful. Let me talk to my dad about it." As she packed up her things, her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "How did it go?" She smiled, typing back, "Really well. I'll tell you everything when I get home." Outside the school, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk. Jasmine waited at the same bus stop where everything had started, but today felt different. As the bus approached, she noticed a patrol car drive slowly past. The officer inside, not Reynolds, someone she didn't recognize, gave her a respectful nod. Small changes, but meaningful ones. The bus doors opened with a hiss. Jasmine stepped on, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. There was still work to be done, conversations to be had, systems to be changed. But today had been a good start. 3 months later, Agent Carter stood at the back of the community center, watching with quiet pride as Jasmine addressed the crowded room. What had started as a small school club had grown into something much bigger. Tonight, over 100 people filled the seats: students, parents, community members, and a surprising number of police officers in plain clothes. "When I was detained at that bus stop," Jasmine was saying, her voice steady and confident in a way that made her seem older than her 16 years. "I was scared. But I was also confused. I kept thinking, this can't be happening to me. But it did happen, and it happens to people every day." From his position against the wall, Carter spotted Officer Reynolds sitting near the middle of the room. The young officer had completed his required training weeks ago, but he kept showing up to these community meetings anyway. Whether out of genuine interest or guilt, Carter couldn't say for sure. Either way, his presence mattered. The Know Your Rights workshops have now reached over 500 students across 6 schools, Jasmine continued, clicking to the next slide in her presentation. And the police department's new community engagement program has held 15 events so far. Lieutenant Wilson, seated in the front row, nodded in agreement. The past 3 months had seen real changes in the department, not perfect, not complete, but substantial. New training protocols, community oversight meetings, regular forums where citizens could voice concerns directly to officers. But numbers don't tell the whole story, Jasmine said, switching to a slide showing faces of students and officers talking together at various events. "What matters is that we're talking to each other, learning from each other." Carter felt a hand slip into his. Lisa had joined him, her eyes shining with unshed tears as she watched their daughter. "She's amazing," Lisa whispered. "I'm scared for her and proud of her all at once." Carter squeezed her hand, understanding exactly what she meant. Their daughter had taken a frightening experience and transformed it into something powerful. But seeing her in the spotlight also meant acknowledging that she would face challenges they couldn't protect her from. At the podium, Jasmine was introducing her next guest, a surprise even to Carter. "Officer Reynolds has asked to say a few words," she announced. A murmur ran through the crowd as Reynolds made his way to the front. He looked nervous, adjusting his collar before speaking. "I'm not good at public speaking," he began awkwardly. "But I needed to say something tonight." He paused, taking a deep breath. 3 months ago, I made a mistake, a serious one. I detained someone without proper cause, and I did it because of assumptions I made based on how she looked. The room was completely silent now. I could give excuses, talk about being new to the area, or the reports of criminal activity or my training, but the truth is simpler than that. I saw a young black girl and I made assumptions, wrong ones. Carter watched carefully, looking for signs that this was just a performance. But Reynolds' discomfort seemed genuine, as did the slight shake in his voice. "Working with Jasmine and her father has taught me more than any training program could. It's easy to talk about bias in a classroom. It's harder to face someone you've wronged and admit what you did." Reynolds turned to look directly at Jasmine. "I'm sorry, truly sorry. And I'm grateful that you turned what I did into something positive for the whole community." When Jasmine retook the podium, her expression was thoughtful. "Thank you, Officer Reynolds. Apologies matter, but what matters more is change." She smiled slightly. "And speaking of change, we have some news to share." She clicked to a new slide showing the Police Academy logo. "Starting next month, the Know Your Rights curriculum will be included in training for all new officers in the district, and I'll be one of the community members helping to teach it." The applause was immediate and enthusiastic. Carter couldn't help but join in, pride swelling in his chest. After the presentation, people gathered in small groups, talking animatedly. Carter watched as Jasmine moved through the crowd, speaking confidently with adults twice her age. When had his little girl become this poised young woman? Agent Carter. He turned to find Officer Reynolds standing beside him. "I wanted to thank you," Reynolds said quietly. "You could have ended my career, filed charges. Instead, you pushed for education." Carter studied him for a moment. "Education only works if you're willing to learn." "I knew." "I'm trying," Reynolds replied honestly, "every day." It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was a human one. Carter nodded, accepting it for what it was, a step in the right direction. As the evening wound down, the Carter family walked together to their car under a sky sprinkled with stars. "So," Carter said to his daughter, "how does it feel? Making real change happen?" Jasmine considered this. "It feels like just the beginning," she said finally. "Like there's so much more to do." "There is," Lisa agreed, her arm around Jasmine's shoulders. "But tonight, we celebrate what you've accomplished so far." As they drove home, Carter glanced at his daughter in the rearview mirror. The incident at the bus stop had changed her, pushing her to grow up faster than she should have had to. But it had also revealed her strength, her compassion, her capacity for turning pain into purpose. The work wasn't done. It might never be fully done. But as their car moved through the quiet streets of their neighborhood, the same streets where Jasmine had once been made to feel like an outsider, Carter felt something he hadn't expected: hope. Not blind optimism, but the clear-eyed hope that comes from seeing good people work together to make things better, one conversation, one policy, one changed mind at a time.